Let's welcome back our friend, philosopher, theologian, and scholar of world religions, the program director for the Center for Process Studies at the Claremont School of Theology, Dr. Andrew Davis.
Good morning again, everyone. Good to see some now familiar faces. Met a few of you last week, and if you weren't here last week, I hope I can meet you today. And what I want to do today is continue to think with you a bit about the spiritual journey. We saw last week some different ways, some different insights, different contours or paths that you yourself might have walked. Not a lot of us actually walked. These paths are linked to this first book of the series that I talked about, How I Found God in Everyone and Everywhere, an anthology of spiritual memoir. And today what I want to do is think with you a little bit about some of the paths, some of the insights that are associated with the second book, which is now in the making. So it's not out yet, but stay tuned. I still have to put the manuscript together and write the intro and the conclusion. But it's based on the same idea that there's value obtained from seeing how other people have navigated the spiritual path, seeing what ideas that move beyond or left behind, what sort of experiences they've encountered, and how that really has shifted and changed everything for them. So, for those who weren't here last week, let me just briefly revisit some of the core paths and core insights from last week, and then we can jump into thinking a bit together about a few different paths today. Does that sound okay? So we saw 5 paths last week. The way of personal experience, the way of nature, the way of dark night, the way of intellectual persistence, and the way of panentia. And these ways were associated with 5 insights that we can take home with us, practical insights, I hope. Namely, pay attention to the wisdom of your experience. Spend more time in the natural world. Recognize dark nights as authentic to your journey, not outside of it, but part and parcel of it. Don't stop being intellectually curious. Someone was talking to me about that in the back. For you are within God, and God is within you. That's the panentheistic truth. So what I want to do today then is look at 5 additional paths and 5 additional insights. And because the book series is about looking at spiritual journeys, I want to target those journeys that have a large influence. So the leaders, if you want, of our age in different capacities with respect to philosophy, religion, spirituality, retreat leaders, all different kinds of fascinating voices who have an impact and see how it is that they've navigated that path, how they've moved forward in their spiritual path. You may or may not recognize some of these faces. I'll say just a quick word about each of them, because I think it helps set the stage a bit. So Irving Laszlo in the top left is the famous philosopher, science, Hungarian intellectual who for many years has sought to integrate science and spirituality in his writing practice. Fascinating figure. Rupert Spira is a retreat leader out of the UK. He studies Advaita Vedanta, that's a Hindu school of thought. He writes quite a bit on consciousness, on happiness, on practical spiritual living. A really fascinating individual. Amit Goswami, at the top middle there, is a Indian quantum physicist. Any physicists, quantum physicists out there? My father? Okay, at least excellent. He also has taken science and spirituality and throughout his career woven them together into retreats, conferences, writing various series of books. Beverly Lindsay is a feminist theologian. She has worked quite a bit in monastic spirituality and writes in global contemplative consciousness, and does a lot of interesting work with various religious traditions. Raymond Moody on the top right, you might recognize as the one who wrote a famous book in the 70s, Life After Life, in which he, after investigating thousands of near-death experiences and those who have them, draws his own insights. What can we learn from this domain of experience? We'll learn a little bit about that later, but he's the one who coined the term NDE for near-death experience. You might have had something like that. Maybe later you can let me know. Jude Carabin, similar to others, is a cosmologist. She also is a philosopher philosopher and writes on science and philosophy. Ben McDaniel, a good friend of mine, professor of theology and expert in Buddhism and what's called process theology, process philosophy. Peter Russell describes himself as a futurist. He's done a lot of work on neurology and the brain and spirituality in the brain and neurology of belief, different ideas along those lines. Sherry Clinton, a Jungian philosopher, writes on spirituality as well. Chris Bosch, I only recently discovered Chris, a really interesting fellow, former religious studies professor, but now writes and practices psychedelics. We'll talk a little bit about that and the relevance of that question or experience of psychedelics with respect to the spiritual journey. It's actually a really interesting discussion that's unfolding in the culture right now. Becca Tarnas is a professor of mythology and what she calls the archetypal cosmology. It's all big words. Don't let them bog you down, but she studies Jung and Tolkien, narrative, myth, and she applies this to her own spiritual journey and that of others, and it's really fascinating way. Karen Johnson and A.H. Alamas, I put them together because they are partners in what's called the diamond approach. It's a particular spiritual path that they have produced and are now speaking about, writing about in ways that are attracting a lot of attention. Very interesting couple. And lastly, Kabir Helminski, I don't know if you can quite see his name there, but he too is a retreat leader and he's a Sufi mystic. Sufism, when it comes to Islamic schools of thought, is the mystical path of Islam. And he writes and draws a lot of inspiration from Rumi. You wouldn't know the poet Rumi? They have few. So these all are intellectuals, they're all individuals. And we're going to be looking at some of the insights associated with their spiritual path. What I want to do, though, before we jump into that, just revisit some of the 5 central convictions we saw last week. Okay, the first one, what one believes about the divine cannot ultimately be divorced from how they've come to that affirmation. That how question of the spiritual journey that I'm personally interested in, and I think if you ask that how question, you're basically readying yourself to hear a tale. It's about a narrative, a story that's about to be told. Not what you believe, but what, yes, that's interesting, but how have you come to that belief? The spiritual journey is interior, it's individual, but I'm convinced it's not meant to be walked alone. And I think a lot of these leaders are too. The most valuable journeys, I would say, are those that are shared. And it's only by sharing them that you begin to derive some insight from them. You can see further because of the shoulders you stood upon, as it were. So with that, let's jump into the first of what will be 5 paths and 5 insights. The first is what I call the way of novelty. And this is the sense in which, for a lot of these leaders, the spiritual journey involves the breaking in of newness. Right? It's not so much past-oriented, looking behind you to what happened then, to what you were, but looking to what you could be. And sometimes you seek novelty yourself. Sometimes novel experiences just happen. They dawn upon you. And so consider the ways in which these different thinkers are approaching this element of newness and the relevance of the novelty in their spiritual path. Beverly Lindsay has a series of amazing mystical experiences. And notice the way she speaks about newness and the elements of the future. She says, as I write, I can still take myself back to that night as luminous records of wisdom and knowledge populated my consciousness, transfiguring my reality away from the past and into the future. And there and then I was a disciple of this new way. She ended up starting a whole new movement of monastic spirituality directed towards females, giving females a place and a voice when it comes to thinking about their spiritual awakening. But notice this question of orientation. Are you past-oriented, as you tend to be, or are you future-oriented? It's significant because the future is the horizon of the possible. The real, but it's not yet. It's what could be for you and for your life. And novelty has to do with possibilities that are realized, that have never been realized before. They're not inherent in the past. Think of yourself with respect to past and future orientation. Now, Peter Russell adventured through various forms of meditation and would pay attention to the experience. He tried to derive insight from it, and he communicates one segment in this meditation saying, often a new way of seeing then dawns on me. It doesn't come as an idea, but as an actual shift in perspective. I find myself seeing the situation in a new way, one free from the ego's thought system. We are very attached to our ego thought system. That's one way to put it. We have a certain way of seeing things, and we're pretty stubborn most of the time. Right? We're unyielding when it comes to changing the way we see things, especially when it comes about politics, society, all those things, of course, but especially the larger questions of metaphysics, the nature of reality. Right? There's something about the spiritual journey that is being open to having that disrupted in a new way, so that your vision changes. And Sherry Kling, my friend, says, we're always in the process of becoming, in every new moment, possibilities of novelty and creative transformation arise. I love this language of creative transformation. Linked to the past, but it's being transformed creatively, so you're on a new path. Element of novelty. Novelty can come through all sorts of ways. One way would be meeting a new friend, sparking up a new relationship. So Kabir Helmensky in the top left here traveled all over the world in his experience and his journey, and he documents what happened to him when he met a new friend, somebody who had standing in the community, somebody who was influential. He says, in Asad Ali's presence, so that Asad Ali is his friend's name, we were revitalized with new energy. I felt that I had been taken by the divine hand and put back on the path I belonged to. There's an interesting correlation here between new energy and being realigned with the path of God, with the path that God has for your life. The element of newness. And the element of newness mediated by new relationship, mediated by a new friend. I fell asleep, says Rupert Spira. That night, I'll get the context in a moment, wondering what, if anything, could be a reliable source of peace and happiness. I was already interested in these matters, peace and happiness. But this event injected new energy into my practice and into my investigation. So what was the event? It was a breakup. So here Kabir Helmensky finds a new friend. Well, Rupert Spira loses one, a horrendous breakup. The woman of his dreams, the woman of his life, and it didn't work out. He had never suffered like that before, but it was an event that sparked new energy into thinking about questions of happiness and peace, and whether these are able to be pursued or attained at all. So in one sense, we might have a friend we meet deliberately, we might put out our hand and shake someone's hand, and that's a new occurrence stimulated by our action. In another sense, it just happens. Somebody breaks off the relationship. Novelty is not always welcome, but newness is difficult. Amit Goswami speaks about love and a new orientation towards life. Love to me has been more or less an inner exploration. When love confirmed what I discovered about unity as a creative, insightful body, the knowledge acquired became wisdom to live life in a new way. Behold, I do a new thing, says the scripture. Right? Is God up to just the preservation of the past? That's quote. Or is the divine element that is shaping up your, what might say, laziness per se, maybe, your contentment, premature contentment. The spiritual journey for a lot of these leaders is about realigning that to a new way of living, this element of novelty. So the first insight is, I think, rather simple in principle, namely to pay attention to how novelty enters your life, happening in every single moment. No one moment is the same. Are you paying attention? And there's an active dimension, I would say, to this as well, namely to seek newness. Try doing something new. Try reaching out your hand to meet somebody and see how that relationship alters the whole trajectory of your existence. This is happening. It's fascinating. There's a few questions that are, I think, worth considering for all of us. Namely, in what ways recent or past has your life been uprooted or transformed because of this entry of unexpected novelty? And maybe you can give some examples. Novelty can uproot, it can disturb. Those are often the most difficult forms of novelty. Okay, are you in need of something new? Think about it. Okay, this could be a new relationship, a connection, career, or experience that might positively disrupt your routine and set you on to a new way of understanding yourself, God, and the world. Hey, what do you think would happen if you started to actively seek out knowledge? Maybe in small ways at first. Maybe try it at the coffee shop. See what happens. Maybe different spots. Same coffee shop, different spot. Start to begin small. Okay, what do you think? Oh, we saw that one. Hey, in this question, do you tend to be past-oriented or future-oriented? Which is bigger for you? I like that question because we all know people whose past is much larger than their future. Even though they're walking forward, they're looking back. That's a good way to trip and fall. There's something about the spiritual journey which says past is what it is. It's smaller. The horizon of the future is bigger for you. And that's where your gaze needs to head. The element of possibility for you, novel. What can be that is not yet. And finally, apply this to God. Is God behind you in the past or up ahead of you in the future? What sort of difference does that make? Is God trying to pull you back to that person you once were back in the golden age of your life? Pushing you maybe from behind? Or is God that element in the nature of things that's up ahead of you, luring you from the domain of possibility? Because that's what God's will. It's interesting to think about these distinctions. I think they play a big part in how we think about the world, God, ourselves. All right. The second path is what I call the way of diagnosis. Now, last week we talked about medical diagnosis, and that was in the context of some of the dark nights that we all experience. But that's not quite what I'm thinking about today. So, in using the language of diagnosis, I'm more thinking about the fact that for many of these leaders, the spiritual journey involves clarity as to what's wrong, clarity as to what the problem is, whether individually, because we certainly all have them, or collectively, as in a larger sort of scale. An advent of clarity about the problem. And that's important. You can't know what to do unless you know what's wrong. Diagnosis comes before the remedy, if you want. So consider the comments that are about the larger domain of society for Peter Russell. He says, I came to see how so many of the problems we face in the world today, personal, social, and global, stem from human decisions, which in turn are influenced by the self-centered ways of thinking that the various traditions have urged us to awaken from, spiritual traditions, religious traditions. Along with everything else we might do to solve the various problems facing us, we also need to tend to their roots. But what are the roots of your problems personally, individually, and collectively, universally, if you want? These are significant questions that, in principle, each religious or spiritual path tries to give us a diagnosis of what's wrong. It applies individually, applies at a more societal level. Individually, Sherry Kling speaks about how she came to understand her own issues and transform how she thought about herself. She says, I've been trying to bring those traumatized parts of me together for decades, but the way I approached the problem was itself the problem. I was laser focused on rooting out whatever it was that was wrong with me so I could have the life I saw for myself. I've come now to see that my rabid pursuit of self-improvement was just internally directed bullying. I felt like the world had rejected me, and because I thought the world could see something about me that I couldn't, I also rejected myself. Are you an internally directed bully? Or are you a friend to yourself? The New Testament says you can't really love your neighbor without also loving yourself. Right? Not an egocentric love, but a proper orientation towards yourself and being content and okay with the fact that you are yourself. It's a friend's relationship, potentially that can be found. Sharon Johnson talks about the trauma of her youth. She says, my emotional history is more complex than Hamid's. Again, I include them. That's Hamid. I was bullied in school. My parents parted ways when I was 13. My mother and stepfather worked with me to heal my pain from the divorce and social injuries I experienced as a child in schoolyard encounters. They introduced me to yoga and self-hypnosis. Right? So the element of bullying, of trauma that we carry with us, that we weren't quite sure of its origins. Spiritual journey, in some senses, That which brings clarity to the traumatized dimensions of ourselves, which, although are behind us, we still carry into the future. Psychotarna speaks in terms of the ecological crisis, the more cultural, communal crisis that we face. She says, I always felt something was missing, a larger narrative that made sense not only of the particular details of the ecological crisis, but also answered the question of how we ended up in this crisis to begin with. I was missing the context of a worldview, the role of worldview. We can point out the many problems, personally, collectively, about what's wrong, but we also need to locate those in a worldview, help make sense, a framework, help make sense of those. And spiritual path becomes I would say, a way of framing the problems that we encounter. Rupert Spira struggled to understand the Hindu notion that the world is an illusion. You heard that before? The world is an illusion. Part of Hindu teaching, certain dimensions of Hindu thought. He says, at some point it became clear to me that a simple misunderstanding had prevented me from fully realizing what is meant by the suggestion that the world is an illusion. I had equated an illusion with something that is not real, not understanding that an illusion is something that is real, but is not what it appears to be. The illusion itself is not the problem. It is the belief that its appearance is real in its own right. That is the problem. And think about yourself. What is it that you are viewing in an illusory way? Something that is not what it appears to be. Maybe God is that. Maybe you are yourself that thing. The way you interact in the world. The second insight would be this. And be deliberate and honest in diagnosing what is wrong. Not an easy thing to do. And my recommendation would be this. Start with yourself and then move out to the world around you. It's far easier for us to point to the world and to protest with signs, to be on street corners, and internally our life is a mess. It's much easier to be outward focused as opposed to inward focused. Now they're connected, certainly. But I think altering and working individually on the dimensions of ourselves that are needing help is a way to indirectly help the larger world around us. Everything is connected. There's an ethic involved in that. It's the clarity about the problem. So a few questions then to think through internally, if you will. Okay, how might you go about diagnosing what's wrong in your life or journey? Do you have the strength to be honest with yourself? That's not a trivial question. It takes strength. Okay, are you sure that the way you are approaching the problem is not itself the problem? This is what came out of Sherry Clinton's quote there. But how might you see things differently? Are you guilty of internal directed bullying? If you are, how might you begin to adjust? Okay, what is the relationship between individual diagnosis and collective diagnosis? Again, a relationship there that I think is probably quite important. And how might a change in worldview alter your understanding? It's a larger narrative, to use Carnegie's words, missing that might change everything. A larger narrative in which to embed these issues, these problems that we see. And lastly, what illusions about yourself, the world, and God are you holding on to? Good question. What is it that is not what it appears to be? You think you could become aware of that? It's a question to sit with. The third way is one of my favorites. I call it the path or the way of beauty, or you might just say aesthetics. And it has to do, in part, with the various domains of aesthetic experience, but music is one of them. I know some of you, many of you, does anyone not like music here? Does anyone not been moved by music? I'll see you delete that. No one actually raised their hand. Irving Laszlo, in the first stage of his life, was an internationally acclaimed concert pianist. Something that's normal for young kids to do. And notice the way he talks about what he encountered in music. It's beautifully put. He says, playing great music on the piano meant a great deal to me. It meant entering an experience of wholeness and completeness of spontaneously created and always recreated perfection. The experience came of its own. I didn't seek it myself. It was the experience of a dynamic unfolding in the realm of beauty. Beautiful way to put it. What is the beautiful he was? That experience of emotive, affective beauty that comes through music. He didn't stop asking questions. Unlike most concert artists, I was not content with just having this experience. I wanted to know what it was. What is its meaning and what are its implications for me in my life? Searching for an answer to these questions called for moving beyond aesthetic enjoyment to intellectual inquiry. I found myself shifting from the keyboard of the piano to the keyboard of the typewriter. The experience, the confrontation with something beautiful caused himself to be creative, to seek expression of that through inquiry, through writing, through wonder. In a similar way, Javier Helminski recalls a series of songs he listened to, the effect of which, the impact on him, which had much more, I think, depth than his own spiritual practice. And that comes out here. He says, I've been listening to some songs by a recently discovered songwriter. As I listened to one song after another, I began to experience a kind of ecstasy, which was all the more extraordinary since I hadn't been in a very good mood today. It seemed to me as I listened to this particular sequence of songs that crescendo was building and deep emotions were stirred. Memories were evoked, powerful recollections of the first stirrings of my spiritual life, of my father, or a powerful sense of loving many people who were in my life. And similar to Helminski, or Laszlo before him rather, notice what he says. I wondered why this experience was so powerful. More powerful, in fact, than my spiritual practices, which have left me with a feeling of well-being and calm, but rarely this kind of ecstatic joy. Afterwards, I felt moved to create, to write, to compose something myself, to give expression to the beauty I had experienced. Don't encounter beauty and then remain the same for the most part. There's something reciprocal about beauty and relational. It confronts us, and having confronted it, we then turn and seek to create it, seek to express it. I think music is one of the quickest ways to transcend it. And I wonder if God can be mediated through the venue of sound. I think that's a really interesting sort of question. Now, Karen Johnson is literally rising from the floor. She was floored because of her mystical experience. It brought her to her knees. And this is how she describes what happened when she got up. Surrounded by beauty, I understood the purpose of life, which solely existed as a tribute to the divine. I watched the world's sorrow and pain coalesce in a band of fog, a superficial covering over the splendor that lay beneath. That's right. Concealed was a unifying force, raising everything up to its own incandescence. This relationship between beauty, purpose, and the divine. It's almost a trinity of sorts, if you want. God and the beautiful, the purpose of life. There's something intimately wedded here. Rupert Spira joins beauty and love together. Love and beauty are vertical interventions of reality into the horizontal line of time in which human existence seems to take place. They are experiences through which we pass out of time and into eternity. The experience of love and beauty, the activity of the finite mind ceases to veil its reality, instead shines through it. The world is revealed as the face of God. I like this. Love and beauty as being the face of God. So the third insight then, you can sense it coming. Invest yourself in the practice of beauty. And I would recommend that you start with appreciation. Right? Start with trying to tune yourself to recognizing the always present fact that beauty is all around. And if you can do that, then turn to creation. Try to express it. You might find many ways to do this, through art, through music, through relationships, through any practical practice that we're always engaged in. Invest yourself in practice. Now consider how and where do you experience beauty in your life? Are there places where it's obvious, places where it's hidden or subdued? And are you paying attention? Again, not a trivial question. Most of the time we're not. And what experience of beauty, what do you think the experience of beauty suggests to you about the nature and character of things that captures something of the purpose of life as suggested there by Lindsay? What might this mean? How do you experience the coupling of beauty and creativity in ways that are similar to both Laszlo and Hellman's experiencing the beauty of things like turning around and stuff? And what do you think would change in your life and your spiritual path if you were able to consciously seek the beautiful? We almost do it indirectly anyhow because we are oriented towards beauty. But there's many interesting studies that show that. But what would happen if you consciously sought the beautiful? Sought to live a beautiful life? Path number 4 is what I call the way of companionship. And there's various elements that I want to try to bring out here that I think are important for us and I think would be relevant for you, okay, practically. So consider Javier Helminski's beautiful statements. When I reflect on my spiritual journey, I see that at every stage I received help from people who had dedicated their lives to the cultivation of spiritual experience, who generously shared their own experience with others who came to them seeking knowledge and guidance. My story is really their story, he says. From my first steps in the Sufi path, I heard it said, it is the human being who matures another human being. Nobody develops themselves in isolation. There's no such thing as a spiritual island. There's elements of companionship that you might not even be recognized that are part of your journey. Now, people are pretty easy to recognize for the most part. I've come to learn. And teachers and mentors. Okay, these are elements of companionship in the spiritual journey. And this comes out in Amit Goswami's talk, or quote here as well. It says, for spiritual transformation, teachers provide the shoulders upon which we stand. The teachers could be dead like Jesus or Buddha. In my reckoning, though, they are not enough. They provide inspiration, which is no doubt essential, but the everyday nitty-gritty needs require a live teacher. How do you find them, he asks. The old wisdom is when you are ready, the teacher will come. Hard to believe, but in my experience bears out the wisdom of this truth. It's an interesting distinction. Of course, Christians are not going to say Jesus is dead per se, right? Not here physically, but with the Spirit of Christ. Arguably, it can be said about the Buddha as well. But there's something about sitting below someone's feet, as it were. Live teachers. I've been incredibly fortunate to benefit from great relationships with my professors, my teachers, my mentors, and I got to tell you, it's bearing fruit even today. Do you have a live teacher that you can approach, that you can learn from? Now, that's human companionship. There is such a thing as non-human companionship, and that can take some interesting forms. So consider Ben McDaniel's comment. As a young boy, I had many mentors, loving parents, good friends, wise teachers. One of the most important was the Guadalupe River in the hill country of Texas. My parents would take me to the Guadalupe River when I was a child. I was mentored by her color, her smell, by the way she could hold you if you swam in her. You could never clutch her in your hands because she was made of liquid, but like God, you could float in her and be supported. A geographic companion, the non-human companion. And to the geographic companion of the river, Jane McDaniel would add another non-human companion. One of my companions in river absorption was a dog. She belonged to me and I belonged to her. There was a mutual belonging. She would swim above water most of the time, but she didn't mind diving into the depths. Her name was Patty. I looked at my brother because we had a dog named Patty, Dalmatian back in the day. I don't know if she could swim with it. Patty was like the Guadalupe River, beautiful, silent, mysterious, and flowing. To see the universe in a grain of sand, said William Blake, is to see heaven. I see heaven in the eyes of a dog and flowing over the river. You might think of this very mundane thing, but there's something about companionship, there's something about companionship in the context of the spiritual journey which shows you the mundane to be extraordinary. Really. Katarna's spiritual journey began on a farm. This is another element of geographic companionship. And not just the farm, but the heavenly bodies. She got interested in astrology, learning about constellations and planets. My journey towards knowledge of the divine began on a small farm when I first placed my hands into the soil of the earth, saw the gift of life spring forth and the growth of edible plants. and came to understand the true meaning of a good day's work. The sun dominated our days, scorching heat, baking our skin and feeding the plants its nourishing light. After dusk, the stars would come out, twinkling into a sky undisturbed by light pollution. Constellations and planets telling a story I did not yet have the ears to hear. But night after night, I would gaze at those stars and feel myself held within a sacred cosmic womb that I had few words to describe. So, human companionship, geographic non-human companionship, animal non-human companionship. What about celestial companionship? The stars, the moon. We recognize them on occasion. We wouldn't be what we are without them, and yet there they are, providing light. An element of companionship. So inside for draw, I encourage you to draw from the wisdom of companionship. And seek to be a companion yourself. There's a reciprocal, relational nature to companionship that is, I think, so essential that comes through these different narratives. Okay, and a couple questions then. Who or what in your life might you point to as a companion in your journey? Okay, are you in need of this wisdom that comes from companionship of whatever kind? How have you been deepened by a teacher, a mentor, a friend? What is it that they've added to your life, and can you think of what you might have added to theirs? Again, the reciprocity. And what role does non-human companionship play in your life? Companion animal, particular geography, a constellation of planets and stars. How are they sources of wisdom? And in what ways do you think it might be helpful to also think about God as a companion? A companion is somebody who journeys with you. They're beside you. They're not behind you or aloof or condemning. They're walking alongside you and also experiencing with you. My favorite philosopher, Whitehead, has a great statement: God is the great companion, the fellow sufferer who understands. You can't understand somebody if you're not with them, beside them. Well, how would our image of God change if God became the great companion? That arguably Christian faith is always intuitive, but never quite expressed very well. We'll end on the fifth way. I call it the path or the way of exceptional encounters. And this spices things up a little bit. So there's these encounters we have throughout our lives which can be exceptional. People describe them that way. Sometimes they just happen. We don't even see them. And other times we do. We'll see a little bit of elements of both that in this final way. So Jude Caravan says, when I was 4 years old, I had my first experience of realities beyond this realm of existence. As I watched while a discarnate light appeared in the upper corner of my bedroom, although curious, I wasn't scared and perhaps too young to consider or now recall its semblance as being otherworldly. In the months and years that followed, I became progressively aware and engaged with clairvoyant, clairaudient, and clairsentient, seeing, hearing, and sensing. We don't need to define words, but suffice it to say that she began to become aware of certain paranormal abilities, as she would describe them. Interesting, exceptional sort of thing, not normal. Right? She also had many dreams and visions in her life, and she's trying to integrate her cosmology, her study of science with spirituality, and she grew from her dreams as she wrote and as she thought. I awoke at 4 a.m, having experienced profound vision and dreams. I sensed myself standing in the present moment, the bow wave and expansion of universal space, the flow of universal time, and perceived the incredible simplicity of how the cosmic mind of God realizes our universe. She always points back to that dream or vision of being very significant for her life and for her inquiry. So one would be this paranormal dimension that people experience. Another, this element of dreams and visions. Sherry Kling would point to dreams and visions as being an essential part of her spiritual journey, and in no small way inspired by the mystic thinkers. She says, the mystics I love best from both East and West spoke of a world that was dripping with God. In their world, hazelnuts were holy, and dreams and visions brought real encounters with a serious sacred. who demanded more from us than mere worship. That numinous presence seemed to desire true engagement. My engagement with God suddenly leapt beyond the bounds of the church into nature, the new sciences, Eastern thought, and mind-body integration. And for Sherry, one of the most important figures was Carl Jung. For years, she said, my primary psycho-spiritual practices had been journaling and prayer. But now Jungian dream work and observation of synchronicities took center stage. I found a river of wisdom running through my life that was just downstream from God's wisdom, Sophia. And that sacred flow began to integrate the pieces of my fractured life. Synchronicities. Occurrences that you might see something in that is significant. Then in Sonia, to YouTube, you're always talking about hawks, between hawks. Then these become an important part of thinking about your relationship with one another and relationship to the cosmos as well. Okay, so dreams, visions, paranormal perhaps occurrences. There's also this element I mentioned at the beginning of psychedelics. And take this pill now. So, excuse me, Chris Bosch is a super interesting guy. He's a former religious studies professor, and I'll say he's interesting because he endeavored to do something that not many people do, and then he wrote about it. So listen to how he describes the journey. He says, although I was a professor of religious studies for over 30 years, my understanding of God is not rooted primarily in my academic studies, but to my psychedelic practice. Between 1979 and 1999, when I was 30 to 50 years old, I did 73 carefully planned high-dose LSD sessions, following a protocol developed by Stanislav Grof. Isolated from the outside world, protected by a sitter, wearing eye shades and listening to carefully selected music, there's that music theme again, I dissolved step by step. I systematically, shattered boundaries of my mind, dissolving step by step into a vast ocean of consciousness. You may not know, but there's an interesting conversation going on under the heading of the psychedelic renaissance. And it's not just a time where people are running out trying to get blasted. It's actually a time of deliberately thinking about and experimenting with psychedelics in low-dose forms and seeing on a medical level how they're helping people with depression, PTSD, overcoming various forms of trauma. But there are also modes of experience that raise larger questions about the kind of universe we inhabit, the nature of consciousness, the experience of God. Beckatara similarly says the first psychedelic session I underwent was so beautiful yet simple. And in retrospect, it felt like the building of trust between myself and my psyche. I love that, the way she puts that. Sitting on a rock facing the ocean, I began to set foot into a new realm, a different way of being. My most pivotal experience with sacred medicines, in terms of my relationship with the divine, took place less than 1 year after I had seriously embarked upon an exploration of astrology and psychedelics. The mode of exceptional experience, the mode of exceptional encounter. Well, what about near-death experience? This is also a mode of exceptional encounter. It's not necessarily one you see. Some do, and it didn't turn out well for them. But it's something that nevertheless happens. Raymond Moody first heard about near-death experience when he read Plato's Republic. That's Plato the philosopher's famous work, The Republic. The first time he ever heard of near-death experiences, and he realized he had no idea that these experiences were also common in the modern world. In fact, they are. Throughout my career, he says, I continued to interview people about their near-death experiences. The thousands of people I interviewed shared with me the encounters they had with God as they were out of their bodies, hovering on the edge of death. Life After Life is the book I wrote in 1974 to describe my research into people's near-death experiences. But what does he take from this? Well, he'll tell us. I think that a dying individual's personal consciousness emerges from the physical world and finds itself in a larger, more inclusive sphere of reality. In that larger sphere, personal consciousness no longer orients itself by where it is in space or time. Instead, in that other sphere, there is a different coordinate system. By that system, personal consciousness appears to orient itself by love, by information or knowledge, He says, I can condense and summarize, I think there is a life after death. And what do you do when you study thousands of people's near-death experiences? You have to come to some sort of conclusion about them. It's interesting. Insight 5. I'm not asking you to do psychedelics or induce a near-death experience. All I'm asking you to do is be open to exceptional encounters and encounters with the exceptional. There's modes of experience that can drastically alter how we think and how we experience the world. So to what extent then has your spiritual journey involved what we call an exceptional encounter or experience? Have you had what you would call an exceptional experience? Okay, and have these involved dreams or visions or perhaps paranormal phenomena? Would you use that sort of language as Caravan and Kling did? What about psychedelic substances? They are near-death or out-of-body experiences. There's a wide variety of fascinating literature on this, being studied from various angles. Is that relevant to you? And did you actively seek such an experience, or did the experience, as it were, seek you? Right? There's some experiences that we can actively seek and induce through practice, through meditation, and there's others that just drop on us like a large weight or a rock, if you want. And finally, how have these and other experiences shaped and reshaped your thinking about God and the spiritual path? What did they add to your journey? So we see 5 paths then, 5 additional paths into those we saw last week. Okay, the way of novelty, the way of diagnosis, the way of beauty or aesthetic, the way of companionship, and the way of exceptional encounters. And 5 associated insights then. Okay, pay attention to how novelty enters your life. Be deliberate and honest in diagnosing what is wrong. Invest yourself in the practice of beauty. Draw from the wisdom of companionship and be open to exceptional encounters. Now, to conclude today, let's just briefly look at some of the ways God is envisioned by these different thinkers, and then we'll bring it to an end. Irving Laszlo says the fitting term for it is mind or spirit. It is a cosmic consciousness. Rupert Spira says the universe is God's dream. It is the activity of a single, infinite, and indivisible whole whose nature is consciousness or love. Jay McDaniel, God is a sky-like mind, filled with wisdom, compassion, and freedom. Jude Caravan, the cosmic mind of God realizes our universe as the unfolding and evolving great thought. Dr. Carnes, the spiritual mystery from my perspective can be recognized as the anima mundi, that is the soul of the universe. Sherry Flint has come to believe now that God is in the fullness of every moment and everything, that every moment and everything is held lovingly within God. Lanzetta implores us to find God within. Peter Russell, God is something to be experienced rather than believed in. God is the light of consciousness shining in us all, that is the transcendental self. Helminski, this unified field of intelligence is always communicating, educating, inspiring. In this self-reflective universe, love is always seeking to be known, to manifest itself to itself in the conscious heart of a human being. And lastly, Raymond Moody, my friend. A wondrous and comforting picture of God emerges from people's stories of near-death experiences. They reveal God's nature as wise, loving companion and counselor, and compassionate educator. Learning about God, he says, is a process that goes on throughout this life and into the next. I thought that would be an interesting way to end, not because you're going to all of a sudden die, all of you, one day. But that death itself becomes yet another way into a deeper spiritual mode of being, a deeper adventure that continues beyond just this mode of existence. Why should there not be another mode of existence? The world is question. I'd love to stay in touch with all of you. Those I haven't met, please come say hello in the back. If you want to pick up some reading material, feel free to do so. You can reach me on my website. I'd love to keep the conversation going. If these insights or ways are resonating with you, I'd like to hear about it. It's constructive in thinking about how I communicate and how I talk to folks about their personal journey. Now, as I did last week, is it okay if I lead the concluding words prayer? Is that okay? So, will you pray with me? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those that trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Thank you.